Well, that didn't last very long, Faraji said flatly, scooping up the small pile of cards awkwardly floating just off the metal floor to shuffle back into the deck he was keeping in his pocket. I just don't understand how this game works, Paul yawned, running his hand through hair he didn't have and hadn't had for nearly a decade. Can you count to 21? It's a bit of a struggle. Things get a little murky after 14 or 15. I'm confident I can make it there, though, Paul replied. Faraji snorted, unwilling to truly laugh at the terrible joke. Aren't you an engineer? Surely you should be better at maths than this. I never said I was a good engineer. That time Faraji couldn't keep his composure, falling into a fit of laughter and nearly losing his grip on the playing cards. It wouldn't have been the first time they had to collect them from floating around the pod, and it was enough of a hassle that Faraji wanted to avoid it. Is that how we got into this mess then? Faraji said, resuming his shuffling with a goofy smirk still on his face. That was me being a bad engineer, Paul remarked. I've just always wanted to spend my last week of oxygen sitting in a cramped, uncomfortable escape pod with the kind of weirdo that walks around with playing cards ready and waiting to go. Faraji kept smiling. So did Paul. But the truth was, they didn't have much to smile about, really. The research vessel they had been on had been struck by a bit of space debris. It had hit something vital. Now they were trapped in an escape pod together, possibly the only two survivors. That wouldn't have been so bad, if one were to ignore the absolute tragedy of it on its own. But there had been an explosion near them as they launched. Their pod had been sent spinning out of its intended trajectory, and its systems, including the air filtering, had been damaged. They couldn't even send a message out to explain what had happened. So there they were, drifting through the infinite emptiness of space in a dented metal can. No hope of survival, and only a deck of cards to entertain them until lack of oxygen shut down their brains. Paul had remarked early on that he wasn't sure which was worse, his imminent death or being stuck in the pod with a card-carrying nutter like Faraji. Then they'd spend an hour or so crying together. Would you have preferred I didn't have them? Faraji asked. Maybe in your next life you should stick a gaming console in your pocket instead. I'll keep that in mind. But until then, it's cards or it's dying with our last interaction being an uncomfortable silence. Paul chuckled. Tempting offer, but I would deprive you of my dulcet tones. Can we change game? Sure. Is Go Fish more your speed? Why not? Paul snorted, back laughter of his own. Faraji divided up cards to be their hands, and then stuck the deck back in his pocket. The two didn't talk about anything for a long time then, only raising their voices to ask for cards. It was an uncomfortable piece, mild entertainment fighting back against the crushing dread of the void beyond the thin pod walls and their imminent, unavoidable demise. It was Paul who broke that near silence. Where do you always have these cards on you anyway? A habit I picked up from my dad. Do you have a 7? Go Fish. Your dad, huh? Yeah, he's a bit of a gambler and loves card games. Everything from Snap to poker to blackjack or canasta. He always has a deck of cards on him, so I got into the habit as a kid too. He used to tell me all the time how a pack of cards was always reliable. They can't break, get corrupted, or run out of charge. They can be used for a million different games, so I always keep Old Reliable on hand. Sounds like a wise man. He is. My mother is brilliant too. I learned science from her and practical wisdom from him. I've been very lucky. My siblings are wonderful people as well. My older brother and sister are a physicist and a chemistry teacher. My younger brother is a professional artist with work in galleries. That's a hell of a family. Why are you such a screw-up? Paul grinned. Faraji chuckled. Hard to say. Shooting me off to space must have been quite the relief, though. I can only imagine. What about you? Faraji asked. What's your family like? Paul shrugged. Never knew my dad, and my mom tried, but had her own issues. It's a miracle I managed to get into this profession, even if I am a crappy engineer. Try to do better by my own wife and kids. Keep in touch and be supportive and all that. Current circumstances accepted, I think I've done an alright job. Faraji nodded. Good on you. How old are your kids? Not really kids anymore, just my kids. My oldest is 24. You're closer to her age than mine. Youngest is 19. Oldest is a teacher too, but she works with the little ones. My son is studying law. He wants to be a defense attorney. They sound like good people. I suppose they are, Paul said. I managed to get that right at least. They're tough too. I know they'll be okay in the end. They lapsed into silence again for a while after that, their game forgotten in the somber moment, each of them lost in reflection and memories. The silence was uneasy on the back of such a candid acknowledgement of their situation, the reality of it not separated from them by a thin veneer of humor. It was Paul once again who broke through that uncomfortable quietness. I don't remember whose turn it is. Me either, Faraji said. Sorry, I got lost in thought. Paul shrugged. Can't imagine why. It's almost like we're going to be dead soon. Almost, Faraji shook his head, but the faint false mirth had returned, warming their spirits even though the interior of the pod was cold. What are we even meant to talk about now? What do dead men usually talk about? Paul asked, although he really wasn't looking for an answer. We've checked off reminiscing about our families. How about God? It seems like it's probably on the list. God, Faraji repeated. Sure, Paul said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. You a believer? Were you ever? No, Faraji shook his head, fiddling with his playing cards. My family was never religious. What about you? I go back and forth, Paul said. But I like to believe there's something more. There's got to be something outside the universe. What's out there? Maybe that's where souls go after death or something. But I don't know what I think about the idea of there being an end. I'd take reincarnation even. An actual sentient god or gods, though? Sometimes I think there's no way an intelligence would make such a messed up world. Other times, I think the world is so inefficient and dumb that there has to be a mind behind it. I guess I'll find out soon enough. That's a take I haven't heard before. God might be real because only a sentient mind could make something this stupid. I'm a revolutionary. It's a loss for the world that I'll be gone before my time, Paul joked. Still a bad engineer, though. Again they found themselves laughing, as they would so many more times over the next several days. Each bout of laughter raised their spirits further, even as the sounds got harder to make. The jokes got more absurd and nonsensical as the oxygen started running out and their brains struggled to form coherent thought. Eventually, they slipped away into a nothingness more complete than even the vast blackness of space they floated through. But they stepped into that emptiness together, with smiles on their faces.
Hello and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different mediums. The one rule is that we can only discuss things in terms of the writing. Anything like acting, mechanics, animation, art, etc., is off limits unless it directly relates to the way the narrative is presented. I am Daniel Radford, author, Unruly Mess of Random Experiences, and also your host. Today I am joined by John Kernan again, who you all just heard reading my short story, Smiling into the Dark. That story, of course, also being the subject of tonight's episode.
I like space.
It has some positives,
Yeah.
a
Not
handful.
much in this story, but you know,
You know. Uh,
lack of oxygen being a big one.
yeah, I think that's up there with people's complaints.
Up there.
Uh,
Space.
anyway, I'm gonna be kind of a little upfront with you on this one. I am not particularly happy with how this one turned out. To me, it feels very rushed because it was, and the quality wasn't really up to my usual standards. On top of that, we talked about back in the first episode of the cycle how most stories blend genres a little just by default, and the people typically don't set out to write a story mixing X and Y genres, and instead they just sort of have an idea for characters or a plot, and the genre mixing sort of comes naturally to them. It turns out, just as a part of that, that is because blending genres together with that as the whole point of what you're doing is actually really hard.
Yeah. It's a lot harder to do intentionally than it is as a matter of course.
Yeah, it. I feel like because I was so focused on trying to mix genres, A lot that was a big part of why the story itself just did not come out quality or execution wise the way I would want it to generally. Which isn't
I
to say,
think the bit of bad luck here is I think genre blending is specifically harder in the medium of a short story than it is in anything else because like one thing a lot of genre blending stories have is world building or at the very least like time to set up. I feel like a lot of genre blending requires setup. Like it's something that's very hard to get immediately into and make obvious in a short amount of time.
at the very least, it does give you more time to sort of organically shift between things compared to a short story where you have a very limited amount of space.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to excuse the pun after the story, but it's a lot easier to show your hand in a short story.
Yeah, but that's not to say that I didn't like the story. I actually really do like the concept, and I would love to go back and revisit it. Just for my own purposes, if not for the podcast or my website or whatever. But I do feel like I ended up in a sort of with a very melancholic drama with pretty much none of the comedic or horror elements I actually wanted to include really coming into play enough. Like I know that they joke amongst each other pretty often throughout the story, but I feel like those are jokes that are funnier for the characters than they are for the audience.
I don't think that's a bad thing. I just see it as an inside joke. I see it as like a good way of showing how these two are working through what they're doing and their familiarity with each other. Like it's the kind of joke that doesn't have to be for the audience to work.
True, but it does sort of take away a bit when one of the elements you're trying to blend in is comedy, which admittedly is not one of my strong suits as a writer.
I don't know what you mean. This story's hilarious. Two guys are dying.
So yeah, I would very much like to revisit the story in the future and just maybe even like rewrite the whole thing from scratch just to when I'm not so worried so much about am I including enough different elements and things like that or like many other things. I might open with a flashback sequence to the destruction of the ship next time or things like that. Try and make things feel more organic and less forced and less rushed.
I mean, yeah, it might have been funnier if they had seen one of their friends who didn't make it to an escape pod crying at the window on the way out.
Would it? I can't tell if you're being
Uh,
sarcastic or if that's a legitimate suggestion.
no, that's a joke that could only actually make it funnier in like certain situations, and even then it would probably be mostly a visual gag. It wouldn't work as well on the page.
Probably not. Yeah.
I'm not a comedy writer, so I'm sure someone could make it work. But it's not me.
I feel like if I practiced a lot and worked specifically to refine it as a comedy, I could probably pull it off eventually. But yeah, comedy, I've done a little bit, and there's often like a couple of small, typically rather dry jokes, sprinkled into what I write. But it is definitely not my forte. But comedy is very hard. People, I think we've talked a little bit about this before, but I think people do underestimate how difficult it is to write a comedy because humor is so subjective. It's very difficult to write something that the majority of people are going to find it as amusing as you do.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate that I kind of blew the comedy, I feel like, because it's such an integral part of what is happening in the story. So it doesn't hit as well now that knowing that it's probably not as amusing for the audience as it is for the characters themselves, because it's such an important part of what the story is about. This idea of uh, you know going smiling into the dark, using humor to cope with a very dark and sad situation and get you through it. So when you go out at the end, you do so with a smile on your face.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a weird thing because You've definitely at least partially delivered on the comedic aspect of it, since not only are the characters like making themselves laugh, but there's thematic resonance there with the humor being not only part of the title and the goal, but like how they are coping, which makes it relevant to the story, whether it makes the audience laugh or not. It definitely might not be the funniest thing straight to the audience, but it's still there. It still gets through, and are funny bits. It's just not a gut buster.
I suppose I could definitely see some of the like, especially the earlier stuff, causing people to maybe chuckle a bit. But I do think, just in general, that if the comedy element was stronger, the actual thematics and that would have hit home for the audience more.
I'm pretty happy with it.
Oh, I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, because I think we talked a lot about this and when it came to dramedies, where bringing comedy to a very dramatic situation can actually increase the poignancy in a lot of ways. It can make it feel more real and make the people feel more real and make it
Yeah, exactly.
and
Especially because of how many people use comedy as a defense mechanism. It's a very
exactly
natural
uh,
thing to find in
ex-
rough situations.
exactly. I mean, I've said it before. Humor is my first line of defense. It is my biggest coping mechanism. The worse a situation feels, the more likely I am to make a joke about it. And it is in like, and that's the thing. Like, I can be funny, but generally, it's not something I'm good at when I'm doing it on purpose in this way. When I'm doing it to be funny, it's something that has to come just spur of the moment naturally for me to really be a funny person. So that's why it works as a defense mechanism for me, I guess, and why it didn't work so well when I was doing it for the story. But that is the whole point of the story because it's exactly you're using humor as a defense mechanism, as a coping mechanism, is what these guys are doing, where they're keeping it light and joking back and forth because that's putting a wall between them and reality that is dampening the truth of the situation for them. And
Yeah, you
the
gotta
thing that
keep
I
it light
really
when you're getting lightheaded.
and the thing that I really like about that like as a concept isn't just that it's a message that resonates strongly with me, this idea of smiling and laughing in your darkest hour is something that I feel very strongly about as a thematic element. But I like that at a character level, it makes sense for them to do not just for themselves, but for each other. Because by constantly cracking jokes, they're not just helping themselves get through it, but they're also making it easier and more tolerable for the other guy.
Yeah, and it's saving themselves a little time too, because if they are, as long as they are genuinely making themselves laugh, that'll use up the air faster.
Also true.
Although it would really suck if they did all that laughing and then, like, right as they ran out of air, some sort of rescue showed up.
Yeah, I thought about that, right? If I wanted this
That
to
would be a
end with them being
bummer.
saved, or if I wanted to end with like people finding them dead. In the end, I may include that ending later on if I change some things or how I feel about it. But in the end, I decided I didn't want to have them rescued, and I didn't want to have them found. The former because I feel like it would have undercut all of the thematics of the story, what I was going for. It would have made all the messages up to that lose some weight, I feel like. And the other option I ended up leaving out because I felt like it was going to swing me too far out of the comedy and into drama.
Depends. It's it's very dark, but the idea of them being discovered, as long as you didn't go into detail writing the actual act of them being discovered, and instead just let the audience know that it happened, I would just see that as ironic twist at the end, in that like the very same coping mechanism they used would be a contributor to why they didn't last until they could have been rescued.
Yeah, I think probably a more skilled comedy writer uh, probably could have pulled that situation off. Definitely, I
It's probably
wasn't.
not super easy to
Yeah,
do,
I don't
that's for
think
sure.
it would be particularly easy, even given, especially given that comedy's hard enough already, without making it that dark. There's definitely people out there that could have done it, but comedy is again not my strong suit at all. So I felt like it was maybe a little outside of my ability at this time, at least as far as comedy is concerned.
Fair enough.
But yeah, the other problem with it from a comedy perspective is it just didn't feel organic, right?
Yeah,
Now, you could argue that it makes sense that it didn't feel very organic and that the jokes felt that little bit forced because they were for the characters, right?
yeah.
But ultimately that whilst that makes sense in universe, that doesn't change the fact that to the writer they aren't super engaging jokes. The payoff for the audience is very pretty insignificant compared to the payoff for the characters, which is a shame, because I love banter and I like writing banter, but I don't know, there was just something about this particular banter, possibly just because it was almost all the story was this conversation happening, and because I was trying so hard to mix comedy into the drama and that slight drizzle of horror, that
Yeah.
I think it just the punchlines didn't really hit home as much as I would have liked.
And, again, to give you credit and benefit of the doubt, I also think it's just genre blending, especially in this sense, is just something that's just not nearly as suited to a story this short. I won't say it's not suited to a short story at all, but you would have been able to make such a huge difference if the story had just been like two or three times as long as it currently is, which isn't really how we do these. But I mean, something like, for instance, starting getting through the first couple of paragraphs of them joking around and talking, and then right before we would get the actual obvious reveal that they are going to die, maybe a little flashbacking some thoughts and times and moments, or maybe a previous not in danger conversation on whatever station or ship they were on before everything went wrong, and then coming back to the serious moment after having a little bit of time to see them just being regular people before they're in their corner and everything. Like, something to develop, because moments like these are very poignant and good, but they are also, in my experience, exponentially harder to write without buildup than with. And I know people can say all that about a lot of things because buildup makes most things better in writing. But there's a difference between buildup making something better and buildup being a foundational step that's really hard to get around. And I think this is one of those.
Yeah, there definitely isn't much in the way of build up into this, for sure. I think if I were to revisit the story, I definitely would have to. I talked about maybe wanting to include the actual like destruction of of the ship they were on, the station they were on, whatever it was. I think either flashing back at some point in the story to how they got to that situation, although that in itself is such a cliche writing strategy. It's a meme at this point. The whole I bet you're wondering how I got here.
Hmm.
But you're either including that or opening with them on the ship living life normally, then destruction, then escape pod. But I had to figure out a way to include all that one way or another and still pull off that sort of twist at the beginning. This realization, oh, this is actually a bad situation. They're not just having a chill time in space.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd say I honestly think you did just about the best you could with what you had. I think to do much better than you did would either take somebody who's just like uniquely suited to writing this particular story, or somebody who's been like an experienced comedy writer for some time already.
I don't know about that. I definitely could have done it better with more time. Even just focusing on the comedy, which is definitely the weakest element. I do think that if I had spent more time on it, I could have produced something a bit better. But that's just the nature of these things. I've been dealing a lot with illness this month, which has made regular writing and editing and things like that quite difficult. And just on top of that, I typically only have a week to write these stories because, again,
Yeah.
for the audience who may not remember this, we've only really talked about it like once or twice. For the most part, I write these stories as we need them for the episodes. So, and I often do that, like start the Monday of the week we record. Is that the best way to do it? Honestly, probably not. It would probably be a lot safer to do them further in advance. But right now, this is the way I do them. Because
I mean, it makes sense, right? Though, because like, yeah, it's for the podcast. We do the thing for the podcast, but it's also partially a writing exercise.
it is, yeah. Having to write something for a theme every week is good practice, especially when it's something that's forcing me to do something hard, like purposely blending a bunch of different genres into something, or outside my comfort zone, like comedy or whatever. It definitely has its benefits, just as a writing exercise as well. I'm not going to complain about that. I'm just saying, it's just the nature of the thing that because of the way I do this and the way that, to an extent, the structure of the podcast necessitates things. Sometimes I'm going to churn out stories for these that I'm not entirely happy with, but that's okay because then we get to unpack the things that are wrong with the story.
You know what? I don't really know when would be the right moment to do it, but you know what I think could also just potentially be a really funny moment in a thing like this, especially since oxygen is one of the things we're thinking about as guys joke. If the if either one of them, probably the old engineer, but I can think of ways you could spin it well with the younger guy too. But if the older engineer had or pulled out had a cigarette, either just a single cigarette or like an almost empty pack of cigarettes, and the other dude just being like, "What you? Why do you have those?" And he's like, "I really." It's like I brought it with me when we left. Like you weren't supposed to have them on the ship either. Like how
Honestly,
how long have you how long
that's
have you had those? And it's like I wasn't gonna light them.
that's actually that's really good. I like that quite a lot. Now I'm annoyed that I didn't include that.
Yeah, it's just
that's
like
really good.
why do you have those? Like, oh, relax. I don't even have a lighter.
I do I do specific like the whole you weren't supposed to have them on the ship either is great.
Yeah, exactly. Because like the whole thing is cigarettes absolutely cannot, nothing that's smokable or no smoking can be done. Absolutely, completely banned in any sealed oxygen providing environment, especially anything in space.
Yeah,
Cannot have it. Cannot smoke ever on a space station, a ship, a rocket, what have you.
just a bad
I
idea.
just like the idea of this old grizzled guy. This is like I don't know. This it's like there's a few different reasons you could come up with, but I imagine it just being some variation of like, whatever, old habit. They make me comfortable. I brought them with me. Okay, is my last one.
You've got your shitty deck of cards. I've got my unsmokable cigarettes.
Yeah, reminds me
Yeah,
of
but one of those things is useful.
one of the things that it reminds me of one of the things I actually really like that I saw, and gosh, I don't know. This might sound like a really small spoiler, although I don't consider it is potential very small spoiler for Trigun Stampede ahead. for anyone who cares. But Wolfwood, a character who one of the things he was always known for in the original Trigun was, smoking. He pretty much always had a cigarette. One thing that kept itching at me in Trigun Stampede is every time you see him, he's still usually got a cigarette on him, but they're all bent, always bent in the same way. And at first, I just found myself wondering how coincidental it was because I'm like, oh, well, maybe it's a character trait. He's always broke. He's never got money, but he's always still smoking. So maybe because he's so shameless about that kind of thing, he's constantly picking up like used, discarded cigarettes or whatever to light.
That would make sense.
And they show a little flashback of when he was younger and he was really excited to show his friend. He found a way to kind of like smoke from this weird, almost seashell like thing he found. He found a way to like put a fire in it and get certain little things in it to like light in a way that smoke would come out the other end. And he had fun doing his childhood smoking with that thing. And then you look and the shell goes up and out at the same angle his cigarettes are always bent out at as an adult.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. I like touches like that. A very good thing, especially because they don't say anything new about it.
Yeah, I
There's
mean,
no really especially obvious hint. You look at that and you go, "Oh,
yeah, I mean, I like things like that, like little weird quirks that have stuck with characters because of they picked them up from somewhere else or during their childhood for whatever reason, and they just stuck. Things like that feel make characters feel very alive.
yeah,
It's one of the reasons I like Faraji's deck of cards because it's kind of a weird thing to always just have on you like that, but the sentimentality and the practicality of it, as a simultaneous thing, tells you a lot about the character.
definitely practical if you're going to be on a ship or a space station." I'm pretty sure every single one of them has at least a deck of cards.
In reality, yeah, probably. Although, again, and I wish I had made more of a joke out of this because I'm sure, like, the material's there waiting to be used, but in Zero Gravity it's difficult to play cards because, they won't, they'll sort of float.
Yeah, but if you do it just right, you could also have some really, really some funny, interesting little moments like somebody like practicing getting good at moving just right so that it's like, oh, hold on, I gotta grab something real quick, and you let go of the deck of cards so smoothly that it just stays floating
Yeah.
exactly where you were holding it while you go do something else with your hands real quick.
Yeah, they're definitely. Yeah, that is actually kind of a cool image. Yeah, I did make a point of remembering that they don't really have gravity, so that like I did show them like how they're adjusting their game to factor that in,
Yeah.
keeping the
The
deck
only
in
way I
properties
could
like that.
critique
But
even slightly in that respect is that you only mention it like once at the beginning and then it doesn't play into anything
yeah,
else.
I wish I had made
That's the only
better
thing you could
use
have
of
done
the
differently.
lack of gravity, and I feel like that would have been something I could really have drawn comedy from that I didn't.
Yeah, bit of a chambered Chekhov's gun left sitting there, or should I say floating. Oh
Definitely.
God, actually no, that's a terrifying thought. God, now I'm thinking about a loaded gun floating around in a space station.
Yeah, I don't know how well that would have fitted into this story, but there's a terrifying and funny thought that would also make
Be the
for a
same
good
thing as
story.
the cigarette, but 100 times worse to the point of not even being funny. Like, no, why do you have that? What's wrong with you?
It's for protection.
You'd kill
From
us all.
what? Fucking
Bro,
xenomorphs? They're not real.
to protection from what? Having a breathable environment around you?
From us going crazy? You know what's gonna make us go crazy? Having a fucking gun floating around the station.
You know what they say? Never point it at anybody, even as a joke. What are you gonna do about that if it's spinning in free float?
Yeah, see, again, like, just something like that, just having something problematic end up floating around and then having this conversation whilst trying to deal with it would have been great. And I
That actually has me thinking of a visual joke I'm surprised I haven't seen in anything sci-fi or otherwise before. Obviously, you wouldn't want to see it in a spaceship, other than like a really cool, big, modern, very different from our real technology spaceship. You can't have a gun on a ship. That's
very very
insane.
bad idea.
But it's insane for the exact same reason as cigarettes, actually, except just exponentially worse. Like, I'm surprised I've never seen a visual gag of that sort that's like there's a gravityless environment and a gun floating around, not spinning quickly, but just ever so slightly rotating on whatever axis it was knocked into when it was left in the air, and somebody walking towards it or being near it, and it rotates so that it's going to be pointing at them, and them just very awkwardly, uncomfortably shifting, not that much, not even grabbing the gun, but like moving just right so that it's not directly pointing at them, in the same way if a person was holding it and waving it around like an idiot, you might move to be like, hey, don't point that thing at me, except they're not saying anything because it's just an object and they don't really want to touch it.
Yeah,
So they have to move in an awkward, weird way because it's not rotating the way a person would point it around, just shifting away from the barrel like, ugh.
yeah. It's one of those things where at first my thought was, huh, that could be a really fun way to play up tension, but then it's like no, because there's no one to pull the trigger. But because of the fact there's actually very little risk of it going off, as long as no one like causes it to misfire by bumping into it or something, or no one pulls the trigger because they're a dick. Because of the fact it's unlikely to actually go off, that would add to the humor of people trying so hard to like stay out of the line of fire. And
Yeah, just playing on the very simple no thought beyond feeling of I don't want that pointed at me.
yeah, I really wish I not necessarily a gun, but just like a dangerous piece of equipment or a part of the interior of the pod that's broken off, or even the ship that's gotten in when they were rushing in or whatever. I feel
Yeah,
like
that's part of why I thought of the cigarette thing, because besides the obvious reasons, there's also just the joke there of like, oh, what are we gonna do? Run out of air?
yeah, there was things like that, a lot of little things like that that I might have thought of doing if I had given myself more time, certainly to execute better. I might have done, although I wish I would have done. Things to remember if I do attempt a rewrite, though, you know, is that I didn't use the environment the characters were in to its maximum potential for anything, really. I don't think I doubled down enough onto the sort of the horror element either of this idea of simultaneously being trapped in a tiny, tiny little box for the claustrophobics, plus the whole existential dread of an endless void outside those paper thin walls.
Yeah,
You know,
that's in
I
fact, I would say that's like the ultimate form of claustrophobia because it's the complete and total contrast. A tiny, enclosed, inescapable space with nothing but the empty void immediately right outside of it.
yeah, space is a great like setting for horror and drama for that reason because you've got the isolation and the claustrophobia as well as just the sheer existential dread that comes from that endless void and all the numerous things in that void that could kill you in an instant. So I feel like I could have capitalized a lot more on that as well.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I feel like keeping that in mind and making that how terrifying of a nightmare scenario this is, and making like that more of a present element of the story, and making it more viscerally felt. I feel like that would have then heightened the joking, not necessarily the humor for the audience, but it would have heightened the whole message of the story with them joking in the face of of what they're going through because it would have been a much more poignant thing, more of a present element to the story that the humor is a defense. I think by making the darkness of the situation more present and prevalent, it elevates the message of the story a lot more because that's how dramedy works. That's what makes it hit so much
Ooh.
so hard is this idea of the finding humor in misery and misery in humor and using those two things to elevate the other.
I think I actually had I don't know what it would be the exact right way to pull it off, but I think I had another fun idea for a joke you could do at the end. And a very similar vein, actually, to when I was thinking about if they got discovered after it was too late, but literally more dark and figuratively less dark and not a potential like theme ruiner. And that's if the pod lost not necessarily all its power, but just lost its lights
Yeah,
right before they ran out of time. Like they didn't have that much time left, but they weren't done yet, and maybe still trying to do something or still trying to play a game of cards, and then just suddenly darkness.
yeah, which could have both been played for drama or horror or both, because it is
Could be
signaling
all
that
three. It
close
could
to
be
the
drama,
end.
horror, and comedy
Yeah,
all at the
but
same
the
time.
idea of two guys trying to play cards in pitch black darkness is kind of funny. I like the idea of them trying to
Exactly.
continue their game and just going, no, this is not fucking working. Someone maybe throws the cards in annoyance at it going dark and is like, oh, for fuck's sake, because now there's all these cards floating around.
It would actually really work well with the cigarette joke from earlier too, because then he could be like, "Oh, I should have brought a fucking lighter after all."
Yeah, yeah, a lot of things. Not using the environment to its fullest is definitely one of the things about this story that I feel like has hurt it quite a bit. But it's something to keep in mind, and something like there's no reason I can't go back to this. It's out there now, sure, but it could be fun to come to like go back to a reworked version of it later and say, okay, here's the new version. This is why
Oh
this
yeah,
one's better.
this the nice thing about something like this is it's not it's not published in a book. Not to say it couldn't be someday, but like until it is, putting it out there doesn't stop you from editing it or changing it. Like
Yeah,
it's still completely it's still completely nebulous as it is right now. You can do whatever.
that I can. Perhaps, I mean, eventually at some point, the manuscript for this story is supposed to go live on the website. Perhaps what I will do is wait and do the reworked version when I publish the written version onto the site. No promises. I may not do this, so no one hold me to it. But I might save it for a reworked version.
Oh yeah.
Because again, yeah, I feel like the story concept has a lot of potential. Like I really like the idea of the story of these two guys just whittling away the time they have left trying to keep their spirits up.
Oh, it does, yeah. Especially, like I said, if you had really just more time and space, because
Huh.
I can think of ways you could expand it into just a slightly longer short story. And I can also think of ways you could expand it into, I wouldn't say a novel. I guess it would still technically be a short story, but a long short story. I guess what I'm saying is I could think of a fifth. I can imagine the changes
Yeah, like
that would be
like a
that
chaptered short story or like a
yeah,
novelette.
the
Yeah.
changes that could be made to make it a good 50 to 100 page short story instead of a short story.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I feel like it's a scenario that you can't draw on for too long.
I might be thinking of pages that are a little too loose and not very densely packed when I say 50 to 100. I guess it would probably be more like 30 or 40, but I just mean it's the kind of thing where you could even go so far as to have like scenes of both of these individual characters, never other characters. What I would do if I were to do something like that is I would present some of the other people in the ship, but only as background characters with moments here and there on screen, but maybe have little periods of time, a chapter or a mini chapter here or there, where there's just a little bit of time following each character, or by each character, I mean either of these two. Once again, not anybody else. Nobody else gets to be POV, but following either one of them around whatever ship or station they were on for a little while before things went bad, really just for the sake of giving them that development so that if they were to joke or talk about anyone else on the ship in the pod, you'd have context for that. Or when they talk to each other a bit more, you have context both for the jokes they're making to and about each other, but also context for the slight awkwardness and stiltedness in their interactions by simply like showing that like, hey, obviously they interacted, they were on a small ship, blah blah blah, but these two people are completely different ages, they had completely different jobs. Look at them going around doing their thing and like despite being on a small ship, barely if at all interacting with each other before all this because they were doing their own thing.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that the ship that they were working on is quite large, right? I feel like that they probably did not see very much of each other at all. So they're not necessarily complete strangers. They would have been aware of each other probably, but I don't think prior to this they had much interaction just between themselves.
No, and that's one thing that I think any reader could say you actually in the short time communicated really well in this story is like it's obvious that although they're having a good time and they do have a rapport, that they are stretching and reaching a little bit both to make these jokes and to like talk to each other for more than just a couple minutes because they were at most before work acquaintances from a distance, strangers passing in the night and all that.
I definitely feel like I captured the characters quite well. I feel like their relationship is very clear. This idea of it's strangers effectively who are stuck together. They don't really know anything about each other. They don't know each other's tastes or whatever. They're they're aware of each other, but they don't know each other beyond just passing.
Yeah, they knew just enough for it to look like a believable work acquaintanceship.
Yeah, like Paul probably knew that Faraji was the cards guy, for example, but
Oh yeah, you actually made that really clear because that's why he like I remember him saying something that was along the lines of like, ah, you always got your cards,
yeah,
fucking weird. And him being
exactly.
like, well, yeah,
Aren't you glad I
I
do?
have reasons. Good, they're coming in handy now, aren't they?
Yeah. So this
Coming in
scenario is why I
handy.
always have my cards. Really, this specific scenario. See, I wish I'd done
Well,
that.
not thi- not this specific scenario. You never know when you never know when you might get stuck in a basement waiting for the parents to get mad. You might be stuck in a waiting room for your doctor's visit, or you might be stuck in an escape pod waiting for oxygen to drain. There's a lot of situations where you could use a deck of cards.
I mean, mostly it's the same situation. All you're changing is the stakes. But yeah, yeah, like that's an
It's like,
exchange
yeah,
I
and
wish
what
they'd
if you?
had.
It's like, yeah, and what if you were alone in here? There are one-man card games.
Have you
There are
ever
card
heard of
games you can play by
solitaire?
yourself. I know how to play solitaire.
Yeah, see, like things like that that I wish I had included. I feel that would have been a really good discussion for them to have, and it's a shame they didn't.
True.
But I can make it happen. I am God for these people. I am the writer. I can just go and rewrite the story better at some point and
You do
include
hold
this
their life,
dialogue.
death, and all things outside and in between in your hands.
It's true. They joke about it being Paul's fault that the explosion happened. It's not. I don't know if I addressed that in the story. I'm pretty sure I did.
It's
It's
your
mine.
fault. You did it. Yeah, exactly. You grabbed your little playset and you grabbed a convenient little rock and you thumped it against the ship. And then when the explosion went off, you took the escape pod and you just gave it this light little twist of your fingers that sent it spinning off course and gave a little middle finger flick to the uh the power and the oxygen generator. Whoops.
Authors are the kind of people you know have killed so many Sims just because they can.
Yeah. Oh, listen, that's just part of being a writer. It's a lot of being a writer is killing your Sims. I think this is why so many people in our server are big sim heads.
Quite possibly, yeah. But yeah, the characters. I do think I communicated them pretty well. Like, I think that's one of the stronger suits of the character of the story is that the characters do feel very sort of defined. I want to at some point clear up their like voices in the story a little bit more still, but I do think their personalities and who they are as people are well communicated in a short time. And through the conversation, we can learn pretty quick that Paul's a sort of gruffer, older, kind of grizzled engineer dude, but he's like it's really easy to imagine him because he's someone we've all met.
I'm just glad you gave me somebody older and grizzled this time who does not have any enough age or any obvious defects to give me a reason to rasp. I love raspy voices, but I can't do them well.
Yeah,
It's hard. I'm not good at it.
yeah. I to an
My
extent,
voice is too silky smooth.
I think I would have. I don't know how I feel about how sort of cliche Paul's story, like his backstory. I don't know how I feel about that. No, there's nothing wrong with those characters who are like, I grew up with parental abandonment, so I've been wanting to make sure I've not done that for my children. And then, look, I've basically done that. Here we are. I could have played into that more for the drama than I did as well, I suppose. But I don't know how I feel about that being his story. Not because I have anything wrong with like I don't have a problem with that kind of character, but I feel like it is very overdone, especially in modern media.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of that. I honestly think that was pretty like the only thing I can think of off the top of my head that I might change about the characters themselves is Faraji unintentionally feels like a bit much of an audience insert, I think. I think he needs I think he needs a little more strong opinion or direction or something else to make him feel less like the audience insert because Paul has more going on.
Yeah, I mean, not every person is
Not
going to have some dramatic history, I suppose, is the thing. Like, Faraji,
No, 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 it's fine. Yeah, he doesn't need more history. I guess I just mean he needs to show off some stronger
personality,
personality
yeah.
or thoughts or opinions because he just he doesn't he doesn't say or do as much that's dynamic as Paul does in their short interaction.
That is fair. I suppose, like, because I think some of that's because I envisioned him as a very sort of wry, mellow kind of guy. He's chill with that sort of that hint of wit to his humor.
Oh yeah, you got that. You got
Yeah,
that part off well. I think he just needs to do a little more with it.
yeah. Again, if I revisit, that's definitely something I could look into. I have to admit, I didn't really feel that way. I was actually pretty happy with how rounded his character was. But if you think that's something worth looking into, I can definitely do that.
Yeah, not and like I said, I think it would only be improved by some like pretty small touches, small changes. Maybe those same humor things I was thinking of would do it for us because I think it could really be as simple as like him being slightly more sarcastic and giving Paul shit about the cards and stuff like that. Just like
Yeah, I
a
think.
little, just him throwing a little bit more of him into the interactions.
Yeah, I do think that uh, the way they joke back and forth, off they do occasionally feel like the same person because I mean, it's largely derived from my sense of humor, which is very sarcastic and dry. So I think ideally, I should the way to make it feel more distinct for each of them would have been to lean harder into the dryness for one of them than the other.
Yeah.
Make Paul that little less grounded in his humor, compared to Faraji, even though Paul is a very grounded person himself as well.
Yeah. But he's also older and has learned not to take himself too seriously.
Yeah, exactly. I do think that if I'd focused on that a little bit more, it would have helped the characters feel more distinct. This idea of Paul being more relaxed than Faraji, more willing
Yeah.
to make himself the joke. And I did a little bit of that, I think, because he's the one I think who first made the joke about being a shit engineer. If this is where they've ended up, but
Yeah, and he also like very good naturedly took the chiding about his cards and everything on his shoulders or on his chin. Didn't care about like this, like you said, the engineer thing. Found it funny, so like he's definitely got that going on.
yeah, but yeah, I think making the characters definitely more distinct, both in the way they speak and in the way they joke and experience humor would have been a good idea as well.
And stuff like this is all great anyways because I mean, I know I already mentioned before that it's a writing exercise, but that means like stuff like this is good because thinking of little ways to improve something that already is, and I know the phrase good enough is toxic for an ambitious person trying to improve, but for a story that is already good enough to justify being what it is is good because it really makes a big difference for the next time you do something like this when you're prepared because so much of these things really just comes down to time and space. But I mean, I guess a lot of life comes down to time and space, but quantum physics and all
Yeah,
that.
I mean
Anyways,
that's
the
that's what we have
what,
aliens for.
but time and space in a more metaphysical sense, because a lot of the stuff we're covering is stuff that probably simply would have been dealt with along the way if you'd had more time. But I
Yeah,
think a nice little brainstorming like this that's so soon after the fact, especially specifically covering ways that it could have been better,
it's helpful. Yeah,
I I honestly think it helps shape not it's not just good for experience, but I think it's the kind of thing that also helps like reshape people's brains a little bit to where the next time you work on something like this, I will think you will unironically come up with more ideas in less time.
quite possibly. Yeah, at the very least, more time to work on it would have given me a lot more time to explore the different themes and the different genres than I had. But I'm in a way kind of glad that it turned out worse than I wanted it to because I think it was good for this, right, for us to be able to
Yeah, no, it's
explore.
good to have more to improve on. I mean, I'm partially satisfied just because when every time we've talked about your other stories, I kind of like, I mean, it's not like they were perfect, amazing stories, but I always wished I had more to critique. I have a lot more to say about this one as a result than I did them, really.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at a story like through this lens of okay, the concept is good and the characters are solid, but it's definitely not as good as it could have been.
Yeah, because if that kind of stuff doesn't immediately point itself out to you, it's just straight up way harder to think of ways something could be better if nothing was already reaching out and itching at you.
Yeah,
Like,
and I think it's
and
good.
and and this applies even to like, not to say any of your stories were mediocre, but that applies to even mediocre stories. Like you could read a story that's not very good, but is completely passable in almost every way and think of almost nothing in meaningful critique just because nothing particularly itched at you or reached out and slapped you while you were reading it.
Yeah, I think that I think it's good for the audience going forward as well. Anyway, just because it's nice to sort of be able to say to anyone listening, we are all fallible. I'm not trying
Yes,
to
it
put. I'm not.
humanizes you so they
Yeah.
can stop looking up at you as the glorious golden god of literature that they
Uh,
have so far.
well, that's not quite what I meant.
No,
More.
I know. I'm just
I am pretty amazing though. No, what I mean was it's good to. I feel better at presenting myself as someone who can critique other stories now, knowing that I'm giving myself the same treatment.
Yeah, and honestly, it just I don't know, especially when it's your own work, feels it feels better having some critiques than just pure, straightforward, mostly positive analysis. I don't know. Maybe I'm weird that way, but when I have a couple more negative things to say, and it's not just only the positive stuff that I say that's meaningful, it feels more full.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I don't know.
And yeah, it's just a nice benefit that anyone listening who is a writer themselves or works in the sort of creative space of that kind of variety can listen to this and then not fall into the same pitfalls I did, and can learn how to improve their own work by proxy by
True.
us discussing ways we could have improved this, which is nice. Which is,
Somebody's gonna get rich off that cigarette you didn't light.
it's mine. Fuck off. On that note, I think we may as well leave that one there. We've had a pretty solid length discussion on it. I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, you do pretty well when discussion of the story is 4 to 5 times longer than the story, and we beat that out even.
Oh yeah,
That was more like 10 times as long.
that's the trick. I just need to keep writing shorter and shorter stories. Yeah. So
Talk for 5 minutes, like, yeah, we did it.
yeah. So that one's that for now. That wraps up the genre blending cycle. Who knows what we'll do next? We'll figure that one out eventually. Until then, as always, for those of you who are listening to this on Spotify or Google Podcasts or whatever, it is actually hosted on my website, radfordwrites.com, where you can find not only all of the podcast episodes there as well, but you can find links to my books, as well as other writing that I post there, most of which probably, will be transcripts for the stories we read through the podcast. But some other stuff will probably pop up there every now and then, and in fact already has.
Good website. I've been there. I'm on it right now. I'm there. You can find me.
Yes, you can definitely find him there, and will continue to do so as I continue to rope him into helping me with more of my projects. You can also
Ooh,
find
rope. I mean projects.
you can also find me on Twitter at DanielWright7, where do things like tweet very little because I'm bad at it, but talk about writing and drop links to interesting things, and sometimes I even meme a little bit. You'll see, as we said, more of John in more podcast episodes going ahead. As he's the person I record most of these with, you'll see him appear in more of my other projects too as they go forward, and probably some other stuff of his own going into the future.
Yeah. As soon as I can change jobs and get one that kills me less and works me less over time, I am definitely gonna start doing more streaming and hopefully more recording.
All right, we'll see you next time then, guys. Bye.
Bye.